There's a little bit of hammering.
We're live now, yes. Hello, viewers. Welcome to Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about things that impact social justice locally and globally. The Alliance consists of a group of academics, activists, artists, writers, poets, and professionals of various backgrounds from around the world who deeply care about protecting and promoting the rights of marginalized groups. We take an active interest in social justice and equity issues. Our goal is to engage in critical conversations that initiate actions to build global solidarity needed for social justice and make the world a more equitable, kind, and compassionate place. Today, we have with us our guest, Dr. Lauren Corman, Associate Professor of Sociology at the Brock University, Canada. And today, our topic of discussion is animal culture and anti-colonial politics. Professor Corman is an environmental sociologist who teaches in the areas of environmental thought, contemporary social theory, and critical animal studies. Her research centralizes anti-racist, anti-colonial, queer, and feminist understanding of social relations and more than human world. Broadly, her scholarship investigates the agency, resistance, and subjectivities of oppressed groups. Dr. Corman is interested in coalition building across social and environmental justice movements and links her work to larger anti-capitalist analysis and struggles. Thank you, Dr. Corman, very much for making some time for us.
Thank you. I really want to extend my appreciation to the Social Justice Action Research Alliance. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And Feroz, I want to thank you specifically for inviting me. I think I'll just start with a land acknowledgement. So there's a lot of controversy about the efficacy of land acknowledgements. Some people feel within Indigenous communities that they've become somewhat of a cursory gesture that doesn't get to the action that's needed in Indigenous struggle and settler Indigenous relations. However, there still is some use to them to acknowledge and have some accountability in regards to the land that we're on. So I'll do a land acknowledgement and then I will point people to some steps that they can take and some actions that they can be involved with to move the land acknowledgement from simply a gesture into a more specific practical intervention. And of course, this is the land that makes my research possible, the land that I'm on today. So I'm reaching you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabes people, which today is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I would suggest as a place to start, if people would like to learn more about Indigenous settler relations in Canada, to start with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations. So there's a series of call to actions that have been developed over a period of time, and they give you some sense of what working towards reconciliation looks like in Canada today. I would also wanted to direct people to the 1492 Land Back Lane organizing that's been happening. This is in regards to a land development at the Mackenzie Meadows development in Caledonia, Ontario, so where I am right now. And people are arguing that that land development is an infringement of Haudenosaunee sovereignty. So if people are interested in learning more about how people are trying to reclaim their land and enact the treaties, you can go to 1492 Land Back Lane to find out more about an Indigenous struggle happening in an area where I am right now. I also wanted to note that the arguments that I'm making are coming from a chapter that I recently published called Herd, Animal Cultures and Anti-Colonial Politics. And this is from the edited collection by Kelly Struthers Munford and Chloe Taylor's Colonialism and Animality, Anti-Colonial Perspectives in Critical Animal Studies. And that was put out by Routledge in 2020. So if you're interested in a more detailed accounting of some of the arguments that I'm going to make, you can check out that book now. I believe it's also available online, which is great. So I wanted to begin a little bit with my background and to help frame and contextualize some of the research questions that have been informing my work over the past 20 years. So I began really focused in the 1990s on issues of violence against women. I was looking at issues of violence against women, particularly in local context, but internationally as well. And as I was studying issues of violence against women within gender studies, I was really being informed by the rise of intersectionality at the time. So intersectionality is grounded in Black feminist thought. So I was reading people like Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, people who are really trying to push back against the white traditions of Western feminism. People who were naming a series of exclusions that had been enacted under the banner of white feminism. So it was an interest in looking at issues of race, but also wanting to understand how race and gender intersect with other issues of oppression as well, such as those related to disability or to sexuality, etc. So this was the kind of fertile ground that I was in the 1990s that was very much attuned to issues of whiteness, interested in the intersections of oppression. So what I mean by intersectionality is the interwoven nature of different forms of oppression. So how issues related to gender and race and class and various different issues that we might call social axes of difference, how they inform and play off of each other and reinforce each other. So that was the intersectional framework that I was operating within. I was also in Manitoba at the time, studying at the University of Manitoba, and I was witnessing the rise of factory farming, so pig factory farming in particular. And to me, pig factory farming was so startling. I was struck by the gestation crates. I was struck by the farrowing crates, this rise of intensification within animal agriculture. So what I noticed within those conditions is that pigs, for example, aren't able to turn around in a gestation or a farrowing crate. Often these animals, who are incredibly emotional, social, and intelligent beings, they can't do more than step forward or step backwards. So to me, this clearly was an example of how violence is being expressed and is being experienced within the non-human world. And so I had this intersectional framework that was grounded in Black feminist thought that was directed towards thinking about exclusions and wanting to have a more holistic understanding of violence. And yet, as I encountered non-human animal issues and the kind of terrible suffering that animals experience within industrialized and intensified conditions, there wasn't a lot of theory or activism about the interrelationship between human oppression and the oppression of animals. We didn't have a language in the same way to name what was happening. And really, it wasn't even considered part of intersectional thought, except on the very fringes. Some forms of animal ecofeminism were starting to look at the intersections. So I essentially started to ask the question, how did things get so bad? So I wanted to understand how we had gotten to the point where there was such extreme objectification for not only humans, but animals as well. And one of the things here that I want to flag is that I'm really talking about North America. So I'm trying to understand the colonial and capitalist legacies and the legacies of white supremacy and other forms of oppression within a North American context. I'm not assuming here that I can generalize to the context that you're in. However, I hope that some of the tools that I offer through my theoretical perspective might be something that could be useful in your own context. So I sort of am walking that line where I'm saying, look, if we pay attention to anti and decolonial theorists and activists, they're really calling for specificity. So your local context is going to be different from somebody else's local context. And the specificity of culture and ethnicity and history is particular to place. So I do take that into account when I'm thinking about how to make sense of phenomena. At the same time, there are some global patterns. We see how colonialism has touched the world. And so in this way, perhaps some of these ideas also can be useful outside of the North American context. And certainly I'm drawing on authors, people like Chandra Mohanty, Gayatri Spivak, people who are writing in the global South, people who are writing in different places outside of North America, or at least have analyses that are applicable to those areas. So I just wanted to flag that right away as sort of against generalizations, because this move towards homogenization and generalization is arguably, as noted within the decolonial literature, a move of colonization to sort of homogenize from the outside, to come in and to label and to represent from the outside. So I'm definitely wanting to flag that that's not the work that I'm interested in. So this question of how did things get so bad? How do we see such high rates of violence against women? How do we see the feminization of poverty being produced? How do we see ongoing issues of police brutality and various forms of racialized violence being produced? And then how do we see issues related to animal experimentation and factory farming? How are these issues connected? How can we understand them through an intersectional and anti-colonial lens, is essentially the question that I came to in the late 1990s. So I began to study the social justice literature. I looked at social justice activism and the scholarly work that was being done to try to understand the seat of various different forms of oppression. One of the things that became apparent to me is that within all social justice literature and social movements that I was encountering, and I was really trying to think across movements. I was looking at the trans movement, I was looking at sex worker movements, I was looking at the women's movement, and I was looking at various different forms of the anti-racist and anti-colonial movements and indigenous movements as well. One of the things that struck me most centrally about all of this work, there was an overarching theme. And that overarching theme was to move the group that was oppressed from the category of object into the category of subject. This is crucial to all social justice movements that I've seen. You see oppressed groups really calling for complex versions of subjectivity to be represented of their experiences in the public sphere. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about subjectivity is really the perspectives, the experiences, the desires, the representations that are generated from within people. It's all the stuff that is differentiates us from, let's say, rocks, right? A rock doesn't have subjectivity, but somebody who is sentient, has the capacity to experience life, has a point of view. So this subjectivity is crucial to social justice movements. As people name their objectification under a colonial or capitalist system, they want to move from that objectified place where you have people who are distorting a representation of who they are from the outside. So it's that, again, that kind of call towards specificity and self-representation and moving to subjectivity and having that subjectivity recognized in the public sphere and recognized by oppressors. So this is popularly talked about as a move from objectification into voice. So voice is a popular way of naming subjectivity. And you see this in the work of Bell Hooks, for example, that she talks a lot about moving into a place of being voiced or coming to voice or speaking back. So this is a very powerful metaphor to name what social justice movements are doing. And it's really about trying to disrupt the colonial representations which have material consequences. So when I represent you from the outside as a colonizer, I homogenize and reduce your subjectivity, I erase it, and I bring forward an objectified point of view. And so the assertion of subjectivity where people can represent themselves and to bring it into a complex kind of understanding, this is where Chandra Mohanty's work becomes very important. Moving away from just talking about subjectivity as a suffering subjectivity. So she's talking about, naming victimhood, but moving away from victimhood and victim narratives as one way of disrupting the colonial gaze. So Chandra Mohanty's work has been incredibly informative, and I'll keep talking about her as I continue with this presentation. But for people who are interested in her ideas, I would suggest reading Under Western Eyes, Feminist Scholarship and Colonial Discourses. So she's pressing for specificity. She's saying, look, We don't need people, within the global north. We don't need white women and white feminists in particular, as she's really attuning her analysis to the feminist movement. We don't need people from these areas coming in and telling us who we are and the meaning of our lives. We have our own forms of resistance and agency, and this is part of pushing back and having that more complex, specified representation of subjectivity that is generated within the community itself. So I want to note here that what's important is that it's not just the proliferation, though, of these different forms of subjectivity. It's an important first move within social justice movements, but it's not the end point. So this is what Paulo Freire talks about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's not just that we have many voices that haven't been heard and been marginalized. We don't just want simply the proliferation of voice. We always need to pair that voice with a structural analysis. So Gayatri Spivak talks about this as well. People are talking about we need to bring in marginalized subjectivity, show richer versions of subjectivity as a push against colonization that is grounded in specificity, but is linked to a structural analysis that changes those institutional and those structural arrangements under capitalism, under colonialism, for example. So things like having your land back is part of that structural change that needs to happen, that is done in tandem with people being able to represent the specificity of their cultures, of their subjectivity, of their voices, but being able to recognize that that must be always paired with this structural change as well. And this is really what people are talking about when they're talking about voice in a politicized way. It's not proliferation of voice, it is voice connected to a structural set of asks and demands and a push for structural and institutional change. So as I considered the anti-colonial and intersectional feminist literature, I wanted to think more about what it would mean to take seriously this analysis for non-human animal subjectivity. So if part of the concern is that you have people from the outside, a colonizer's approach is from the outside to homogenize, to objectify the other, what does this mean for thinking about representations of non-human animal subjectivity, where I can never be an animal? And so if I'm interested in doing the work that looks at the intersectionality of human oppression, as well as non-human oppression, how do I do this in a way that actually keeps with the social justice and anti-colonial emphasis that has pushed against that reductionism, the homogenization, the lack of specificity, and really the erasure of complex subjectivities? So one of the things that I did is I began to turn to the scientific literature called cognitive ethology. So cognitive ethology is the study of animal minds and behavior. And to me, this was a very rich terrain to begin to think through questions of animal subjectivity. So I started to look at researchers who were doing field work, who were looking at the emotional lives of animals. They were looking at the social lives of animals, and in some cases, even the cultural lives of animals. So we see that some animals have the capacity to socially learn and then to pass down that information, those lessons. Even when the death of the innovator of a new behavior has died, we see the persistence of those behaviors down through generations that's not based on genetic inheritance. So I was really excited by the possibility of cognitive ethology as serving as one way that we might begin to pay more attention to the complex subjectivity, the complex voices of animals. On the other hand, I was concerned, is this just another way that the Western scientific traditions claim to know and represent fully in an objective way who animals are and who people are? We see colonial legacies through the scientific traditions in the West. So I don't think that it's a cure-all. I think it needs to be regarded with a kind of critical gaze, but it does give us one starting point to start to think about the complex subjectivities of animals. This is a move against the kind of even reductionism that we see within the animal movements that haven't often paid attention enough to thinking about our relationships with animals, their relational capacities, and their emotional and social capacities, that kind of really complex layers to how they experience and know their lives. So it's a definite move against sort of public opinion about animal, which often objectifies them. But even within the animal movements, we can see that the ways that animals move into the public sphere is sometimes in that suffering, victimized discourse alone. And not that we shouldn't talk about their victimization. Again, Chandra Mohanty is important here. When we think about victim discourses, though, it can present a kind of reductionism that doesn't allow us to think of them beyond their suffering. And all different social movements, everyone that I've seen across the board, and this is really informed by people like Edward Said and his work on Orientalism, there is a desire to not be seen as simply a suffering victim. So while we need to name victimization and suffering, we don't want to just stay there. So again, we have cognitive ethology as one way that we can move against purely victim discourses. However, I do want to say, too, that as critical animal studies, the specialization that I was hired to do at Brock University, as critical animal studies has emerged, and the center of critical animal studies has been to try to bring an intersectional analysis into its work, I think there's a way that critical animal studies sees itself as kind of at the helm, or it is sort of the avant-garde of the animal movements, as if no one else has ever thought about non-hierarchical relations with animals, as if it's the first to think about these issues in this kind of complex way. And I've really tried to interrupt that. I think that when we look at Indigenous thought in Canada, for example, we've seen clear articulations of human-animal relationships, which are much less based on a vertical understanding, based on stratification and power over. There are examples, many examples of horizontal relationships. Mi'kmaq traditions, for example, talk about all my relations. There's a notion of equality that's built into the worldview of Indigenous groups within Canada. And so without generalizing, because Mi'kmaq culture will be different than the specific other nations and how they understand their relationship to the land and other animals, I do think it's worth noting that this is also, if done in a respectful way, can be a site of knowledge about how to confront the colonizers' view of both oppressed people and oppressed animals. And not just to prop up cognitive ethology as the only way of thinking about human-animal relationships in this fresh, non-hierarchical, non-domination sort of way. I was also interested in the intersectionality and anti-colonialism as I was interested in those frameworks as something that might interrupt the whiteness of the North American animal movements. So I have sort of two dual projects that I have been concerned with. On the one hand, there's this preoccupation with voice and subjectivity of both humans and non-human animals as a crucial move within these different movements that can challenge the colonial, oppressive, homogenized view from the outside. And I've also been concerned with challenging the animal movements itself. So, for example, the whiteness of the animal movements in North America and its single-issued focus actually reproduces a very speciesist discourse. And so what I'm talking about here is that, for example, when the animal movements in North America, whose diversity is often obscured by the voices that get paid attention to most, there are, there's a tendency within activism, within its dominant form, to represent animal practices globally as being barbaric or savage. And so this is part of the single issue focus of the animal movements in North America. And this is something that really concerned me. Darren Chang and I have written an article that will hopefully will be out soon that talks about, for example, the pandemic and how the wet markets in China became a site of racialization for the animal movements. So this is what's called animal-linked racialization. So what we notice here is that the animal movements, they reproduce a kind of hierarchy based on who is considered most human. And Chinese people in their animal practices in a wet market are seen as less human. They're seen as not being civilized. And so we see a kind of irony. People that you would expect to be attuned to thinking about issues of speciesism actually use animalized and speciesist discourse in their animal advocacy. So this here is an argument that I'm drawing on primarily from the work of Claire-Jeanne Kim. She wrote a book called Dangerous Crossing: Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age. What she shows us crucially in that book is that within the settler colonial imagination, within those historical legacies, how different racial groups are constructed is based on their animalization, or how animal-like they are seen. And it's very specific historical legacies. So the histories of Black people in the United States are tied to particular kinds of animals. So they're seen as being chimpanzees, or they're seen as being non-human primates in some ways, or domesticated dogs that have the possibility of becoming wild. And that animalization, to animalize, to dehumanize a group, has been central to the colonial project. And it's how the categories of race are constructed. So this is about racial hierarchies based on animalization. The histories of Indigenous peoples in Canada, for example, they have different forms of animalization that are attached to them. So Indigenous people would be understood within the settler colonial imagination as being wild and worthy of killing off, worthy of having bounties on them. So that's a specific kind of legacy. Chinese Americans have a different legacy. They're seen as more vermin. They're seen as populations to eradicate in different kinds of ways, or as a kind of pestilence. But what we see here is that different racial groups are constructed through this rubric of animality, in which at the center is the white, cisgendered, straight, able-bodied male, and that every other group that is named other, which is essential for the dehumanization of the colonial project. What we see here is that different racial groups are seen as outside of and ranked from that center of what it means to be human. And what it means to be human is to have subjectivity, is to have a perspective. And this becomes absolutely crucial, because to be recognized as being a subject means that you have moved from the category of object or property into the category of a potential rights holder. And that means you have some protections. So this struggle to be recognized as a subject is central to human rights campaigns. So what we see here is this rubric of animality. This animality serves as a metric of who gets to be considered human and in that central sphere of moral concern. So this is concerning. So the very construction of race, the social construction of race, as Claire-Jeanne Kim talks about, the question of the animal is not incidental. The question of the animal, that animality, is integral to constructing race. So this is one of the reasons why we should be paying attention to how animals are constructed, because of course it hurts animals to be rendered as an animal, as object, as without subjectivity, but that category of the animal can be placed and mobilized and applied to different racialized groups. And this is also true for disability. This is also true for trans people. Anybody who's been seen as outside that sphere of moral concern, right? So the Western colonial imagination imagines men of a particular kind at the center of what it means to be human, and everyone else is outside. And so you have the scrambling to be recognized as fully human. You have a scrambling to be recognized as having subjectivity because it has material consequences. People live and die, animals live and die under this ideological framework. So we need to always be pushing for structural change given that, right? We need to rethink the whole lattice work that props up that notion of subjectivity. We need to push back against it, show more complex versions of subjectivity in order to move people out of those constructed, dehumanized, debased categories. And this is the reason why the animal movements in its single-issued approach, which has erased the voices of people of color so frequently who have been doing work globally for animals, their voices often aren't heard, they're ignored. And so what we see is that if you pay attention to people of color and you pay attention to people of indigenous people, you see more complex versions of animal subjectivity. And you see people doing this work for a very long time. I'm thinking here about people like Manisha Deka, who's a scholar in Canada. She talks about drawing on people like Carrie Wolf, animalized humans. So people who are seen as even more animalized. You have Black people who are ranked in a particular way. You have animals that are also more animalized and humanized animals as well. So the position of a rat is different than the position of a dog, for example. So we can see those metrics, those taxonomies of power, as Claire Jean Kim calls this, as being integral to the project of imperialism, to the project of colonialism, to the very foundations of the settler colonial imagination. So this is why I draw on people like Billy Ray Belcourt, who really talks about, for doing animal work, we need to understand colonialism as the context. It's really not just about sort of an intersectional understanding that's like, well, we just need to add in indigenous people and their perspectives. We just need to add in people of color. He's really saying to make sense of how the world has gotten so inequitable, both for humans and animals, we need to centralize an anti-colonial perspective. So I wanted to just close by highlighting the animal culture part as being part of that project. So when we think about the historical legacies of Western colonialism and the denial of subjectivity, non-human animal subjectivity, we see that animal cultures have very much been erased. So what it means to be a subject and what it means to get into that sphere of moral concern within that white, male, straight category, the category of a rights holder where you're seen as a full subject, part of that to differentiate human beings from the rest of the animal world and from various different racialized groups and people with disabilities, et cetera, has to say that only those in the sphere of moral concern have culture. We are the sole purveyors of culture. It's the province of man or the domain of man. So one of the things I wanted to draw your attention to as we wrap up this talk is that animal cultures have increasingly been noticed and increasingly been studied by anthrozoologists, by conservationists as being crucial to the conversation about who they are. So people are increasingly talking about the multiculturalism of non-human animal life. So if you look, for example, at the dolphins of Shark Bay, Australia, they have a society that has mothers within that group who teach their daughters how to hunt with sponges on their rostra, so on their beaks. They put the rostra, they teach their daughters how to put the rostra on their beaks. Sorry, they put the sponge on their beaks, and then to dive down into the ocean floor and kick up all the bottom feeding fish. This is something that's a really innovative hunting technique, and it's not done by dolphins outside of that context. So this is a clear example of animal culture. So you think about what is lost when animals are killed or when they're harvested and when their lives are obliterated. There's also the potential for cultural loss as well. So that's not to say that animals that have evidence of culture, so that social learning passed down through generations, that they should matter more. But when we are thinking about the animal capacity for subjectivity and for social relationships, for emotional capacity, what we see is that there is certainly evidence, growing evidence within what some people call the animal culture wars about animals' own social rituals, their own dialects, their own ways of forming societies. And it really rubs up against and pushes back against the colonial tradition, which tends to see as a way of grounding itself with the very foundations of the settler colonial imagination, is to hang on to an understanding of what makes us superior, what makes us better than and able to exploit the objectified other, is that we are the sole owners of cultural capacity. So while we look at this interesting rise in cognitive ethology and the capacity for animal culture as maybe an interesting side note, I would say that kind of research that is both within cognitive ethology and various different indigenous worldviews, that actually becomes fuel. This becomes a kind of traction for arguments against the homogenization, the lack of specificity that's often represented in non-human animal life, is to talk about the cultural capacity of various different animal groups. It's about the specificity. Again, we think about the specificity that's called for by people like Chandra Mohanty, to pay attention to particular locales, the specific ways that people there and beings there understand themselves, their unique subjectivities. And I think that animal culture is one part of that conversation, to include that in this complex subjectivity. And as that moves into the public sphere and people recognize that complex subjectivity, it starts to erode the objectified view from the outside, the colonial distortions, and allows beings to begin to have their complex subjectivity recognized. It moves them more into the sphere of moral concern, where they are more likely to be protected and more likely to be recognized as rights holders. And so this is crucial work of an anti-colonial perspective that includes non-human animals. Reclamation of culture, the naming of culture, has been central to anti-colonial movements, to say we had a culture, we have a culture, we've been practicing it, we are reclaiming it. We have always resisted. We have our own forms of subjectivity, our own forms of agency that make up who we are as a people. This kind of way of talking about an anti-colonial project, people like Edward Said are talking about reclamation of culture as being crucial to moving against the colonizer's view. But if we take that seriously and we want to think about this in regards to non-human animals, I think we should also include their complex subjectivity, which in some cases will also include a discussion about their cultural capacity and the reclamation of their cultural capacity and recognition of that and acknowledgement of that within the settler colonial imagination, to push back against those sorts of constructions from the outside. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening and for the opportunity to share some of my work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Corman. The paper is absolutely brilliant, and your arguments are, incredibly on the spot. But it also opens a lot of the places for further discussion and actually looking at from the perspective. You've looked at from a few perspectives, but what are some of the ways to look at the same thing from different vantage point. You talk about the work of Chandra Mohanty and Gayatri talked about the Spivak. One of the points that I found very interesting and fascinating, when you connect the idea of actually looking at the specificity of victimhood, that basically do we understand the victimhood, from a point of view that it is only not the victimhood, but to understand that, their voices are important. It is important for us to understand. Now that brought me to something that I think will interest you deeply, what is happening in Bangladesh, where I'm located right now. So if you Google, you'll see that right now Bangladesh is going through one of the devastating floods we have seen in past 4 decades. And as you know, because of global warming, the southern part of the country is actually going under the water, rising water level, and the saline water is entering. Now, what happens because of the global warming, because of rising water level, people who were once depending on part of the land for agriculture, they are compelled to go into the forest for hunting. Now, what happens a lot of the time when this men go into the jungle for hunting, Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world, they get killed by tiger because of human-animal interaction. Now, this is where it gets fascinating, and I think a rich vignette for complexing the discussion. I'm going to quote here Arundhati Roy, where she says in a recent book, "My seditious hurt is that never to complex what is simple and never to simplify what is complex." So our commitment not to look away what is brutal and the oppression, and never to forget and continue to see what is happening and to deepen our understanding. So what's happening here in Bangladesh is you see one of these species, Royal Bengal tiger, is in the verge of extinction. Now you have the animal rights groups, advocates from the West, who are looking at, so I'm sorry, I lost the point that when these men get killed in human-animal interaction, so there is a kind of ways of actually trying to protect themselves from these tigers. So people there, they band together for hunting tiger. Now, we are talking about hunting a species that is on the verge of extinction. It is one of those endangered species, Royal Bengal tiger. So when the Western animal rights group and advocates try to understand this particular phenomena in Bangladesh, they look at it from two perspectives, most common to narratives. One, Bangladeshi men, brown men, are oppressing the brown women because when the men get killed, a lot of these women get ostracized because they're considered to be cursed, and they are the reason why these men have suffered this poor fate. So this is obviously superstition and etc. So when you look at, if you want to understand the women's subjectivity in this part of the world, from a white feminist perspective, the brown women needs to be rescued from the brown men. A. B, the tigers are also getting extinct by these brown men who are not only oppressing women, who are also, pushing one species on the verge of extinction. Now you have the Western animal rights group coming here and working here without looking their own complicity in global warming, without looking at their own complicity in the colonial history, where the British men used to hunt tiger to prove their masculinity, which was absolutely unnecessary, just to prove their, power, the toxic masculinity, etc. I will ask you, a few in a follow-up and a question to complex this discussion. And again, I said the commitment not to simplify what is complex. Now, Spivak also talks about can the subalterns speak? It's not that we haven't been speaking, we have been speaking, but where the Western Eurocentric colonial authorities were ready to listen to us, and are the voices being heard still, and that's where, I look forward to find out, get a copy of the paper, and then actually, to go through it, is heard, H-E-R-D and H-E-R-D, heard, where you talk about it. A lot of the times, when we are talking, I just published an article yesterday where I talk about more than 19 million children in Bangladesh are living under absolute risk because of this climate change. And again, the female children are disproportionately impacted by the climate change. Young girls are forced to child marriage, and even some of them are forced to prostitution in this part of the world. Again, if you want to understand, if a person wants to understand the subjectivity of the girls, from the Western perspective, again, the brown men are, oppressing the young brown girls, to force the prostitution without looking at the complexity that, so I write the article, can the girls of Bangladesh speak like Greta Thunberg? When Greta speaks in her voice at United Nations Parliament, yes, it is very inspiring and, excellent that she has the capacity to, hold the entire leaders of the nation responsible for their action. But I wonder if the girls of Bangladesh would get similar audience if they wanted to talk at the United Nations. I wonder that Greta, her country, is much more equipped to fight if things comes, worse to the worst. We don't. And once again, you have brought something incredibly important, the animalization of people of different races. Now let's talk about fact. And that is where one of the things that we try to do on this platform, we felt, and I personally also felt, being in academia, that academia does an incredibly amount of important work. But when it comes to knowledge translation, when it comes to actually knowledge mobilization, we have a lot of things to do. We need to do a lot of work in that. So when right now, because of the climate change, Bangladeshis are trying to cross border, they're first met with bullet, not a consideration that, okay, what is happening? If you see what is happening right now in Bangladesh, we have 1.3 million refugees coming from Myanmar here, and again, the situations are further complicated by changes in climate change, circumstances that are happening. I think scholars like Chandra Mohanty, a scholar like Spivak, what they are doing, they are changing the narrative and challenging the Eurocentric paradigm of or ways of knowing, actually how something is possible to know. And I think one of the very integral tool of colonization has been actually accepting what are the ways of knowing. Like, what are the ways of knowing? I talk about the epistemic extraction of human experiences. That it's not that people have not been writing about these matters. They have been writing about it for a century. I personally have gone to Canada in my 30s, and I have read rich amount of literature from this part of the world. But to what extent I was able to actually leverage my knowledge, living here, which is also ontological and epistemological, in the areas of researching epistemic violence. When I talk about anti-colonial literacy, when I talk about neo-colonial literacy practices in Bangladesh, right? So, education has been an incredibly effective tool of colonizing, and continuing colonizing, this part of the world. A lot of us, mistakenly believe that in 1947 the Brits have left, but the literacy practices in Bangladesh is very, very much colonial in layers and layers and layers of it. But when you try to contest these ways of knowing, you see a kind of pushback from the Eurocentric ways of knowing. And here I will use this expression very, deliberately, is that when it comes to this, conflict of ways of knowing, epistemic conflict, the Global South's ability to know gets regularly undermined in the circle of academia. And, I'm saying, not a lot of spaces are there that actually welcomes this radical ways of knowing. So there we have a lot of conversation. You talk about, the expression that you used was the ways of knowing animal voices, the ethnology. Was it the expression you used, Dr. Carmen?
Cognitive ecology?
Yes, cognitive ecology. Thank you. Cognitive ecology. I'm quoting the work of Laura Brodsky. She talks about 7,000 universes, where she talks about what the colonial process has done, that almost every 50, in some researchers say that in every 15 days, one language is actually disappearing. Now, when a language disappears as a direct aftermath of colonialism and capitalism and late-stage neoliberal invasion in other parts of the world, living in a world that is hyper connected and hyper-globalized, when a language dies, with it dies everything that has been ever known, everything that has been ever expressed and felt. And therefore, the colonial project of knowledge production and dissemination gets further, accentuated, further, reinforced. So my first question to you, after giving this, my response to, your paper, that how do you think is in the knowledge production and dissemination space of knowledge production and dissemination that we can create a rich exchange where the knowledge doesn't essentially come from the global north to global south? How can we actually create a process where the knowledge from the global south can also go to the global north?
Right, it's an important question. You mentioned Geriatri Spivak and the subaltern, Can the Subaltern Speak Her Famous essay. And, my understanding of that, she's saying, look, it's the wrong question to simply say, let's try to force the subaltern to have their voice and to be heard. She talked about the subaltern studies group and the way that you had scholars try to collectivize and to have the subalterns speak in one voice. And she was saying, look, this is the wrong move. If in order to be heard, people have to erase their specificity across culture, across geographic area, that is the colonizer's move, even when done within the global South. So she is talking about not asking the question, can a subaltern speak, but working against the conditions of subalternity, which I think is such an important intervention. And so I think this gets to your question about knowledge production. So if we're not changing the structural conditions where we have platforms and resources in particular that are being used to give people on the ground, both activists and scholars in a variety of different worlds, distribution of resources where people can have access and produce their own knowledge making, I think that's one central. So there's a kind of material intervention about who gets access to the technology, who gets access to the journals, who gets access to the platforms, what spaces are available for people to speak. It's not simply the speaking is enough, because I think you're getting to a question of what it means to be heard. But if the structural conditions and the material conditions are such that the very white supremacy and colonialism is built into our institutions, how do you have people then be able to represent themselves, to talk about their complex subjectivity, if the structures themselves are working against a recognition of and a possibility for them to have their own platforms? So I think that it's, in terms of the global North, I think, and its institutions, one needs to recognize the historical legacies of white supremacy and colonialism that are built into the foundation of those institutions. So stepping down and stepping back and is one. I think it's not just proliferation of voice, although there needs to be an intentional cultivation and curation and a wanting to hear from people. But it's also about distribution of resources. Who is hired? Who is chosen to speak? Who is allowed to have the opportunity to share their experiences? So I think it's about paying attention to both the material and the sort of more subjective experiential knowledges and allowing them to come forward, but in such a way that means a relinquishing of power on behalf of those who historically have held power. So there's no way that I think that you can have that kind of robust conversation when there really is a willingness of scholars and activists in the global North to hear and pay attention to activists and scholars in the global South, if there hasn't been some relinquishing of power within those communities and within those institutions. So it's not just like we need more, again, simply proliferation of voice without bringing that structural and resource and materialist analysis into the conversation. So that's how I would initially respond to your query. It does seem to me about rethinking power relations and a relinquishing of power that's traditionally been held, that's embedded in those institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Ngugi from Ghana, he writes about something, the book that he published in 1982, Decolonizing Mind. So one of the challenges he talks about is how do we, as Ngugi later has stopped writing in English, although he was educated and he's a very prolific writer. He stopped writing, in English language. He starts writing in his own language. And I think language is incredibly important, as you have talked about. Very important is that understanding animals' subjectivity, is that who is actually giving the voice,
Exactly.
Who is, and you have very rightfully, you have very brilliantly pointed out that complex voice of animal. And you have pointed out that how animalization of different races to different degree has been a very old colonial practice of dehumanize. And here is the problem, I think complexity of actually understanding the axis of epistemology and ontology is that what does exactly, how do we actually mean dehumanizing? And in my shallow understanding, it brings in the concept, looking at something that could be on a tangent of anthropocentric perception about subjectivities, that this is humanizing and dehumanizing, and how does it actually work? You talked about how Asians have been viewed with kinds of animals like vermin, how Black people have been viewed as primates, and how I would say, based on literature and what I have read, is that the Indians, the South Asians, have been viewed during the presence of British colonial masters is the black dog. I mean, it's interesting that how two terms are strung together, where you have the racist part of it, where that is anti-black element is clearly present, and also the animality is connected here to understand that what is it that you are worth. My question, I guess, would be is that if that is the kind of language, discourses that is constantly being produced within the structure, and when I say structure, I don't essentially only mean the structure of academia. I mean the structure that decides the resource allocation, and it's backed by neoliberal support. If you look at post-colonial episodes of it, in order to bring changes in its which is impactful, meaningful, and for the long-term transformative social practices, how would you think about connecting academia, as you have and I looked into the research that you talk about connecting your work with the communities. I mean, not essentially only writing, but also connecting back to communities. How do you view it, and what would be some of the pragmatic initiatives or steps that can be taken?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that critical animal studies tried to do in its founding in 2006 was to honor traditions of activism, not to prop up activism as being the sole providers of knowledge or that they're somehow immune from critique, but to recognize that activists on the ground have experiential knowledge, they have wisdom, that is really important for scholars to listen to. If you're going to talk about a particular phenomenon and you're not consulting with and thinking about what's happening on the ground, you're going to miss all sorts of things. And I think that activists have the opportunity, if people are open to it, to challenge some of the discourses and some of the circular, insular kinds of knowledge production that can happen within the academy. So again, that kind of openness for true consultation and to build relationships with people outside of the academy. That kind of relationality is actually something that is a thread throughout all the work that I do. It's about people building relationships as a kind of microcosm of what we want to accomplish politically on a much larger scale. That politics is essentially, I think it's Patrice Jones who talks about how politics is just relationships writ large. So I think that there needs to be a greater attention to building genuine relationships with people who are doing work on the ground. So when you're talking about, for example, people coming from Western contexts into Bangladesh and making certain proclamations that are grounded in a colonial and white supremacist framework, there's very little humility to be actually deeply consultative about whether or not they should even be there and whether or not is their place. But if they are going to be there, this is something that I noticed with doing the radio show that I did for a decade called Animal Voices, is that there sometimes is an ask within local communities and on the ground activists in the global South to have people within the global North pay attention to and specifically give resources and money to people who are doing the work there. So not even, don't be ideologically involved, don't actually come here, but they might want the solidarity in terms of money. You have power, you have privilege, mobilize some of that to draw attention to and help resource the projects that are informed by our cultural knowledge and our knowledge of place and our knowledge of the particular geographies and the contours of the specific echoes and continued reverberations of colonialism where we are now. So that would be one practical way that I would say we could navigate this kind of knowledge exchange, but also support for activists, is that I sometimes think, white people in general should just not be involved in the activism of people of color and the larger international sphere, specifically given these colonial legacies. But I think it is more complicated than that. I think there's possibility for kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of international solidarity when it's done from the ground up. And it's not about knowledge being produced from a top-down perspective. But it has to be deeply consultative, and it needs to be grounded in relationships in which people in the global north, particularly white people, are having that humility to say that they don't know, and to not do the cookie cutter where they take their frameworks of, let's say, rights, the rights framework, which is coming out of a particular Western tradition, especially in the animal movements, and then placing that on different contexts. That, again, is a colonial move that erases the complex subjectivity of humans and animals and the particularities of those problems within the locales themselves, and isn't taking responsibility for the larger phenomenon of, let's say, global warming, which absolutely is an expression of colonialism, right? It's not taking that responsibility. And it's simply keep doing this kind of one-size-fits-all colonial move of taking a framework and placing it over the globe that has nothing to do with relationality, listening to the voices of humans and animals in a complex way, in which you don't just go to one or two communities or one or two people and say, you are the representative of your group. Speak on behalf of all. I have done that cursory work of saying I've consulted with you, and now we have a few token people. What does it mean to build relationships with people if they want them over a period of time, which is grounded in resource allocation and humility of scholars and activists in the global north? And in particular, I think there's some interesting solidarity work that's happening with people of color and indigenous people within the global north, reaching out to and having those more fruitful dialogues. I think that white people in particular mostly need to step down and also share resources. And I mean material resources, and I mean money, and I mean opportunities.
I'm going to bring a bit of positionality here. So when I first moved to Canada as a graduate student in Canada, at Brock University, I vividly remember that my dear professor, John Sorensen, he offered me a piece of cake and said that, Feroz, this is a vegan cake. And honest to God, I didn't know what a vegan cake actually means. It was like, what? And then I somehow remotely connected, because there is a word vegetable and vegan, there is some kind of similarity. Maybe there is some element of vegetarianism there. But subsequently, when I did courses on animal rights, global social justice and animal rights and a global perspective, I personally feel that I don't think I would have the kind of understanding if I was born and raised in Canada. I think that, and then where I'm talking to you right now from a village in Bangladesh, not in the city, in the village. And I have been working here for the past 20 years. I've been an educator, an activist, and literacy activist, working with the marginalized people. Particularly, I grew up, growing crops and raising animals. So my understanding of my relationship with animals, yes, I am grateful to a lot of my professors where their theoretical training helped me to understand my own relationship with the nature and with animal, but it's not a cookie cutter understanding. There is particularly if you consider and critically examine the Western Eurocentric knowledge, and I'm extremely happy, to be very honest, that you are drawing your work from on scholars, based on Chandra Mohanty, people like Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, and Vandana Shiva. But if I want to understand the subjectivity of the South Asian or the part of the world where I'm from, there's always been a duality in the colonial center. Now, when the British came to India at that time, India alone was producing 47% of the global GDP. By the time in 1947, when British left India, the economy was reduced to merely 3%. The part of the world where I'm from, where I'm sitting at the moment, the British engineered famine killed in one famine 10 million people. We have been clothing the Westerner for the past 300 years. In 2013, the factory collapse killed over 1,100 people and wounded over 2,000 women working in the clothing factories. Right now in the pandemic, the Western companies have canceled over $1 billion worth of product, just canceled. And who are impacted by it? Mostly women. So the duality of the Western civilization and the European countries, in one face, they appear to be the beacon of hope, the light of humanity, kindness, compassion, and all of that. I'm not saying I don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater, if that means anything. There are a lot of goods in there, but I want to expose it. I want to approach it. I want to approach it critically, not just take it, uncritically. Okay. But at the same time, the despicable ongoing brutality that happens on a daily basis. And this is where the animal rights activists in the global north can actually brace themselves in humility. But here is the challenge of humility. If I want to look at it truly, that in order to operationalize humility, is that when the capitalistic colonial understanding of self depends on my acquisition of material and non-material thing. It's not necessarily material, it's also non-material. I have accumulated a set of ideas about this is me, I am Firoz, so and so. And if that understanding is also, that understanding of me includes that, well, I'm an animal rights activist, I'm a kind and compassionate person, and I am the protector of animal rights. Then what happens, that conviction, and I use this phrase very deliberately, is that conviction of knowing creates a dangerous kind of ignorance where we deny to look at things intersectionally and critically. And lo and behold, if that comes with the power of whiteness, then we are in a place where the engagement further debilitates and actually disempowers people on the ground who are working, who are surviving. Now, to me, that the engagement of social justice is not only epistemic at all, and I will vehemently and passionately actually protest it. Now, where I am living, I have people who will knock at the door saying, I haven't had food. Now, this is reality right now. We are dealing with global pandemic, and then we're also dealing with one of the devastating floods. And again, least responsible, one of the most vulnerable country in Bangladesh. Bangladesh emits 0.3%, greenhouse gas, 0.36%. But when you want to bring in this intersectional discussion, I'm not saying everybody, a lot of the times what happens, activism, which is not informed with critical and transnational feminism, like understanding things from a transnational perspective. And I'm saying this, Dr. Corman, deliberately, is that the conviction of knowing creates a dangerous kind of ignorance that actually disempowers people who are actually working on the ground. And that again, what you mentioned, something incredibly important, is the politics of representation and the homogenization of actually the subject, that, oh, this is what they are. But then when you try to fight back, I'm talking from my own positionality, being a brown man from a brown land at the moment, it becomes difficult to navigate. It becomes, when you yell from the global south about global solidarities, that you may be living in Canada, but a lot of your comfort, a lot of your security and safety is ensured at the expense of brutal exploitation and despicable, horrible exploitation that happens on an ongoing basis right now, right here. Now, that is where the epistemology needs to meet the ontology, where the cultural capital of the global north, the social capital of the global north, people in those spaces, a lot of the times don't examine their privileges. When I talk about, I'm borrowing from Bourdieu, is that it's not only the capital, the economic capital. You all people that is considered to be cultural capital, social capital, symbolic capital, economic capital. Now, if you pile that together, and if you see our positionality, we are doomed by structure, we are doomed by design. And then then you have solace in the work of Spivak, is that, can the subaltern speak? Are you willing to hear what we have to offer? Are you listening what we have been telling? Therefore, can the girls of Bangladesh talk like Greta Thunberg, right? So that sort of complexity of the discussion. Now, how do you think that the duality, starting from the so if you think about the scholars from I'm gonna give a scholar's name. People have struggled to actually classify him, whether he is a philosopher or sociologist or Vedic scholar. It's very hard to actually categorize him. So his name is Jiddu Krishnamurti, if you know. And he's somebody who has never gone to university, but he's an original, challenging thinker. And when I talk about humility, without operationalizing humility, to deal with him is incredibly difficult. One of the things he talks about, and again, that is very connected to colonial and Eurocentric ways of knowing, is that our violence towards nature, our violence towards animal, is actually connected, or deeply, is that when we create the separation between the observer and what is being observed. I repeat what he says, the difference, like, if I am and again, what has been the tool that was used by the Eurocentric scholar is that, I have a part of me that can know things logically, that can be objective. Therefore, my capacity of being superior. But that same claim of objectivity eventually used in many cases of creating objectified subject is that, your subjectivity, you cannot know. I mean, we often, limit our understanding to Rudyard Kipling. Oh, no, not at all. Kipling is very much alive in our conviction of knowing that is operated, that is alive right now, right here. And that's when Spivak talks about, is it possible for us to go to a place without having a certainty that can you actually understand them, or with the prescriptive mentality that I'm going to spend X amount of time in that mountain, in that patch of the land, and I will come back with prescriptive understanding. This is the solution of that part of the land. And hence I can write, if I talk about economics, like, Jeffrey Sachs, End of Poverty. I'm giving the example of in economics. So, and then you meet people like Krishnamurti, who tells you that, it's the difference, but if you look at the Eastern ways of knowing, it has always been, Unitarian, but the Western ways of knowing was analytical. And when we try to understand things analytically, means I can understand a part of it without considering the whole. But if you look at, Buddhist tradition, if you look at Eastern tradition, if you look at Buddhism that stemmed out of, Vedic philosophy, the understanding is not hierarchical. I'm not saying that it doesn't have its own problem like caste system. I'm not saying that it doesn't have, toxic masculinity. I'm not saying that, we don't have our own problems to deal with. And just like James Baldwin has said it very, very clearly, is that when the victim develops a capacity to actually, articulate her reason of victimhood, then the victim no longer remains only a victim that becomes a threat on the oppressor. So that relationship needs to be examined critically. So and then when he makes a distinction between the observer and what is being observed, and therefore what can be known, these analytical ways of knowing. Hence, I am not part of the nature. I am apart from nature. Hence, I have the ability to know the nature, and therefore it lies out there to exploit, to manipulate, to extract profit that serves the desire of the capitalistic desire that operates in my desire, what I want to do. And then decolonization of ourself and our psyche becomes incredibly important if we at all want to be actually create that collaboration with each other, the embodied ways of knowing. Now, we have heard about phenomenology, obviously, that's there. But even that phenomenology is that what informs that phenomenology, to what extent that has been decolonized, that something becomes a question. So I think it is incredibly important to ask question and not have an answer, but to accept an answer that we cannot question. That is dangerous. I think the Eurocentric knowledge production dissemination was an integral part of colonialism. I think understanding human-animal relationship needs to be decolonized. I think that if the scholars from the global north, academics from the global north, activists and writers from the global north actually takes some time and make it one of their agenda, is that can we create a global solidarity where the understanding can be cross-pollinated, and we can actually not know the word humility as a word from dictionary, but we can actually operationalize it in our ways of being, not essentially just the ways of writing and producing knowledge.
Yeah, there's a number of things that I wanted to pick up on here. I think in some ways you're talking about identity and how identities are produced through a colonial epistemology, how we know ourselves and as we know ourselves as separate, and then being able to produce knowledge from the outside. I mean, the inspiration for my PhD dissertation was the phrase, the voice of the voiceless. The idea, this as a trope operating within the animal movements, but also elsewhere, is really about that kind of arrogance that you're speaking about and that kind of separation. And this is something that concerns me. This is why people like Donna Haraway, who talks about beings do not pre-exist their relatings. So this notion of the self in relationship that is throughout, much indigenous thought, a lot of different cultures outside of the settler colonial paradigm. So I think that you're getting at something about how people enter into the public sphere, the academic sphere, or even are recognized as having a voice when they've cleaved themselves from a more deeply immersive, embodied way of knowing that doesn't see oneself as being separate and above, right? And that the academy offers an opportunity through the accumulation of social and cultural capital to speak from that position of authority, which is generated through the ongoing kind of subjugation of various other forms of epistemology that are much more immersive. So I think the voice of the voiceless and its echo and reproduction within the academy is definitely something to pay attention to, especially when people are presenting themselves as being concerned with questions of colonization, but continue to reproduce those power relationships in which they are the white savior, in which they are understanding themselves, even when in consultation, as being separate and above, and being able to collate the knowledges and embodied experiences of human and animals, as if there is a pure space to speak from in which you have generated your knowledge. And the Western colonial system presents the academic with a kind of carrot that you can do this. And then you are able to speak on behalf of and save the world. And I think that even when done with a kind of benevolence, it really does still produce that colonial white supremacist paradigm that in some ways is grounded in the very creation of what Hannah Arendt calls superfluousness, the rise of modernism, the rise of the colonial imagination, the settler colonial imagination is about, as you're talking to, the superfluousness, the rendering of superfluousness and violence done to huge groups of people that continues today. That superfluousness was about the achievement of a colonial capitalist structure, but it was also an ideological achievement, and it was an achievement of identity in which people would be invited, even in their oppression, to identify with those who are recognized as being fully human within this understanding of the civilizing process that Rudy Kipling talks about, where he takes on and talks about the British Empire as taking on the white man's burden. And this is what, concerned me with the animal movements, that they were taking on that understanding of civilizing the rest of the world. But they were doing that also in relationship to animals. They were taking on the burden of being the voice of the voiceless without that deeper humility that you're talking about, which sees self in relation, which is porous. It's never occurring in a vacuum. It is never pure, and it is never distilled from the rest of life, the multiplicity of those webs of relationships. And then it's about attending to the historical legacies that have rendered humans and animals superfluous through the rise of modern industrialism and the colonialism that it's couched within. So I completely agree with what you're saying. There is a kind of intoxicating identity position that the academy, even in its benevolent forms, can present to allow people then a platform to do their good work without asking the harder question about how is my subjectivity being constructed through these institutions and these discourses in which I understand myself as a knowledge producer, even when in collaboration, that still is somehow separate, above, and a purveyor of knowledge by my capacity to collate, distill, and analyze from the outside who other people are, with an erasure of their own complex embodied ways of knowing, right? It's still a power move, even when done potentially drawing on these different theorists or these different schools of thought. So I take your point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's I know it's Donna Haraway. She talks about the story that stories it matters, the story that stories the world. So it's actually I think it's also when we want to know about the subjectivity of animals and women and other co-inhabitants of the world. One of the things of the risk of working in the areas of epistemic violence, what happens is that not only conscious, in the unconscious process, the reification of identity that stays in me. So if Dr. Corman says something that contradicts with my ways of knowing, which has actually consolidated or become part of me, part of my identity, unconsciously I can feel attacked. And to what extent I actually can be reflective enough to actually undo that sort of ways of knowing and actually examine, and that's where the operation of humility is incredibly important. One of the very leading one of my direct professors and a leading anthropologist of Bangladesh, Dr. Zahir Ahmed, he has asked this question to. I'm sorry, I had to pose it out to this channel. I think two interrelated questions: constructing an account of why English colonists and other Europeans had a right to appropriate the land, and second, constructing an account of why they had a right to clear the Indians out, much as they killed wolves and cleared forest in order to make way of civilization. What do you think?
Did you want me to respond to that?
Yeah, yes, that question is directed to you.
Okay, well, I mean, this is part of it is the, this is Said's argument as well, that you need to have a particular way of knowing that allows colonization to be enacted. So I think that clearing of the land and the killing of, indigenous people in Canada and in the United States and the killing of animals was justified because the colonialists understand themselves as entering into empty lands. They did not see that they were encountering some bodies that had any value. They were seen as being an obstruction to the achievement of civilization. And those lands were seen as unoccupied because they weren't cultivated in particular ways and they weren't occupied in certain ways. And that, using Claire Jean Kim's understanding, that was about seeing those beings as not being human. And so it again is that animalization that allows for the objectification and the resourcism of both human and non-human animal groups, and a particular understanding of the environment and nature as being untouched, uncultivated, and unused by indigenous people and by the animals that were on the land. So there's a notion of the empty space that is being filled and made useful through the colonial imagination, but it's about imagining it as being justifiable and even benevolent to do this work of raising both humans and animals, although never really achieving it, into civilization, right? Through the colonial religions, through the ideological apparatus of the colonial project. And so it's just a complete abjection, erasure of those groups as being subjects in which you would have to account to, or that have experiences that are all in equal measure or relevant to your own. If they're seen as in a state of barbarism and a kind of eternal animalized state, you don't have any compunction within that particular framework about slaughtering humans and animals and feeling that you're doing the good work of civilization and that you are settling the land in a way that is useful and in God's image.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Corman, despite your busy schedule, to give us some time. And we, as I said earlier in the beginning, that one of the core objectives of Social Justice Action Research Alliance is actually to create the global solidarity by engaging in critical conversation that actually inspires informed action to make the world a more compassionate, more equitable, and just place. And what as many Black scholars have very actively participated in global solidarity, either what was happening in Vietnam, whether what was happening in Philippines. They took part in it. And I often quote this: is that, as Martin Luther King said, there comes a time where silence is betrayal. As we have been having active conversation regarding Black Lives Matter and Idle No More movements, from Bangladesh, and creating this conversation in multiple languages, so that when George Floyd is brutally murdered, in America, we understand that how it is connected to a global capitalist system, and we should take an active participation in protesting and actually doing something about it, not just thinking, that is not something that connects me directly. It does, and we are connected. And as Krishnamurti said, that it's our illusion that we are separate that makes us violent towards each other. So to create a more compassionate, equitable, and just place, we have to build global solidarity. And there is engaging in critical conversation is an incredibly important part of that. And thank you very much for making some time for that conversation. We're very grateful to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation and for the incredible work that you and the organization is doing. It's really inspiring. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed my time with you.
We will have future conversation. I see inshallah means, God willing. So have a great day, and it's evening here. Have a wonderful day, Dr. Gorman.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye.